Holman-Moody, when I went to work there, and prior to that, was that was the go-to place if you raced Fords. It was quite a big operation at the time. I mean, it was the place, well, by the standards of that time. You know, if you look back at where the facility was, it was an old barracks at the airport is where their shops were, and it was scattered at different places. Quite an operation for that time period. A lot of talented people there. They started in the 50s, from my understanding. Of course, when I went there, I guess I went there in late '63. So they were established, and you know, it was not a glamorous place by any means, because I say it was, their shops were in different barracks and warehouses that the airport had used. But I remember some of the photographs and some of the things that some of the guys had been there for quite a while told me back in the Y Block days. You know, they were with the superchargers and so forth. They were very instrumental in getting that program going for Ford. As far as Holman and Moody, they were entirely opposites. John was a businessman, and probably as smart a businessman as certainly, well, I've only ever worked for one other businessman, or for one other businessman, and that was John. And so he was the business part of it. Ralph was the racer, the people part. People didn't necessarily like to deal with John. He was strictly by the book, very strict. I remember when I got the job there, and scared to death, went in for the interview with him, and he took everybody in their office, in his office, and done an interview. You know, what do you expect out of this, and so forth and so on. And you know, very intimidating, very firm, but I certainly respect that. Did then, and still do. Now, Ralph was the guy that would walk through the shop, and at break time he'd sit down and have a break with the guys, or, you know, just not so much outside the shop. I didn't see him that much, but he was a car guy, you know, and didn't want anything to do with running the business from my understanding. But they made a great team. One that comes to mind that people would know now is Waddell Wilson. And Waddell actually came to work there just about the time that I was leaving. The others are quite a few of influential people at that time that people today is not going to remember. But I remember there was the guy that that was the general manager, a guy named Howard DeHart, that he was John Holman's right-hand man that run the place. And the foreman of the engine shop, his name was Lee Terry. He came from Virginia, and he was overseeing everything that happened in the engine shop. Quite a guy that was very influential on me, and was quite a benefit for the company at that time. Was a guy named Willie Thompson. And a lot of people now know his son, Kenny Thompson, that is a renowned builder of cars. Really one-off cars, non-standard, something nobody else has done. And his dad was the same way, and his dad is the one that taught me balancing. I remember he had had a head injury in a modified at the old Charlotte dirt track where the fairgrounds used to be, and but it didn't affect his ability to teach, and just maybe explained it in a little different manner. But and another one was a guy named Luigi Lazowski that was a real craftsman. He came from Indy cars. So the team, the Holman-Moody team, had the resources to hire these people that were as good as you could get at that time. As far as, and they were a warehouse also for Ford. If you wanted a Ford part, you got it through Holman-Moody. Now, there was two parts of Holman-Moody that a lot of people didn't know it then, and most people don't know it now, but John, he had a passion for boats in the marine industry. So there was a Holman-Moody division in Long Beach, California. And it wasn't as much tied in with Ford as the NASCAR thing was. But gosh, it was a big part of their business. I think he done very well financially off of that also, because there was a semi that went back and forth from Charlotte to Long Beach every week. We did special projects like the 24 Hours of Le Mans, Monte Carlo road race. And in fact, that was one of the first jobs that I had when I actually went there. I didn't get to go directly into the engine shop. They put me in the race shop. Holman-Moody was, it was a full racing service facility. They built the chassis, they built the cars, the bodies, it was a turnkey deal. Now, a lot of the teams that they supplied engines for had their own deal also, but quite a few of them got the cars, the whole deal from there. But the Monte Carlo Road Rally, I was there when they first went there, and when Ford came out with the 289, and we first thing we did was they wanted a little more power and durability for the chase cars. And they used, of all things, an Econoline pickup truck for chase vehicles. And I don't know how they did it, but I remember one of my first jobs was 289 high performance engines with the 4-speed top loader transmission from that era. And the way that Econoline is, you're sitting beside the front of the engine. So one of my first jobs was, here, the engine transmission mounted in the car, we need the shift linkage on the column to shift this 4-speed transmission. That's how I got to know some of the fabricators, because the guy from IndyCar racing, he's the one that kind of took me under a wing and helped me do that, because I'd still be working on it if it wasn't for that. But no, they did. And then the 24 Hours of Le Mans, when they won that, that was quite a deal. But that was all done in-house there. They used common sense to build the race cars more so than, of course, we didn't have computers and so forth. So they had engineers. But the engineers were almost secondary to the technicians, the people that actually done the work. They had a lot more control over how things were built, it seemed like, than they do now. In other words, now it seems like it's separated. You got your engineers over here and you got your technicians over here, and they're butting heads all the time. It seemed like they worked together so much more, because I think having the caliber of people that had to build those cars, and gosh, we went out and kicked butt, so it worked. The engines at that time made 510 horsepower. And I mean, we kind of softened up the compression, dropped RPMs a little bit, and they were, if I remember correctly, in the 430 to 450 range. And at that time, all those big block Fords, single carburetor, made 510 horsepower. They all did, and they were redlined at 7,000 RPMs, for quite a few years. So but basically the same engine, just detuned. Same cubic inches, just the biggest thing was compression ratio, a little milder camshaft, and so forth. The engines for the NASCAR side of it, and then for the Marine and even the Le Mans, our procedure was at that time, you didn't get a block and heads and whatever from Ford. You got a complete engine. There was a warehouse over there. I remember that they had, the engine was coming in, there were 427 cubic inch FEs with 2 4-barrel carburetors. That's the way they came from Ford, completely assembled. They'd been fired on the run-in stand, and that's it. No dyno and nothing, just fired. And there was a warehouse full of those things in 64, 65. They were stacked in this warehouse, you know, on big pallet racks that were, you know, 5 layers tall. And but the procedure was, we would do usually about 20 engines per week, and serviced all the teams. And there's a lot of Ford teams, you know. And we'd get those engines complete. Well, on usually Thursday evening, Friday morning, sometimes even into Saturday, depending on how the week went, it'd bring all those 20 engines over to from the warehouse to the engine shop. So those engines would be disassembled. You would all the heads would go to the head shop, all the crankshafts would go to the balancing shop. You know, parts would be clean. So they were basically blueprinted. And my job at that time, when I did get to evolve into the engine shop, was doing all the balancing. And then as I got the balancing done, I would help on cylinder heads and then help on assembly some and dyno. But by usually, and we worked quite often 7 days a week at that time, which was great for me because I was a young guy, you know, and I was, you know, I needed the money, and you get time and a half over 40 hours. So it worked good, and it did for most guys. But our normal day was Monday through Friday. Monday through Thursday would be 8 to 5, 30 minutes for lunch, an hour for supper, come back at 6 and work till 10. That was 4 days a week. Friday, you'd work from 8 to 5. Saturday, 8 to 4 to 5. Sunday was a little more lenient. You didn't have to work. You didn't have to come in at 8 o'clock. But like I say, the place was run very strict. At that time, Mr. Holman's office was where you came in. You had to walk by the window in his office to hit the time clock. You didn't want to be at 8:01. You know, you wanted to be there 7:58, 7:59, and you go straight to work. But anyway, getting back to the engines, usually by Monday morning, I had 20 crankshafts. And the way that we did them that time, they were pretty close. You know, you didn't have to use heavy metal and do a lot of, you know, whatever that we do now. They would come to the balancing department with the flywheel and harmonic balancer bolted onto them, standing on end. And we'd take all the rods out of all 20 engines. They were all just put in on a workbench, and we balanced them, or I did. I'd balance them by not removing any metal, just by putting them in sets of 8. And sometimes you'd have some overlap, and you'd have some left over from the previous week to swap around. And they were all magnafluxed. The cranks were magnafluxed. Used the same pistons, put new rings in them, new bearings. And by, like say, Monday morning, I had all those 20 crankshafts lined up to balance. And it was pretty quick. So by that afternoon, I'd have all balanced. They would have, in the meantime, they were decking blocks, honing blocks. Wasn't no line honing or anything done at that time. And the cylinder head guys were doing the valve job, decking the cylinder heads and so forth. This was not a big shop either. You know, everybody kind of worked back to back, you know. So, but by Tuesday, we were assembling engines. And by Thursday, those 20 engines had been assembled and off the dyno, and they were picking them up. It sounds really crazy to think about it now. Yeah, it was every week, you know, because they raced a lot of races back then. Of course, you know, stuff broke back then not like it, you know, it's unlike now. I mean, pieces broke because they weren't meant to run as hard as they did. So, but that's the way the engine shop worked, and it was a well-run procedure. Of course, drivers and crew chiefs would always whine about, you know, he's got more power than I got. I mean, that still goes on today, you know. It'll go on as long as we race. But they weren't, you know, engines have their own quirks. But as far as power, these things, 510, 510, 510.
Well, Holman-Moody back in the early 60s, you know, they were Ford backed fully, and they built the cars and the engines for all the Ford drivers and for sale to the public and whoever. And we built a lot of engines. They also had the parts department at Holman-Moody. Also made all the wheels for NASCAR. So, you know, there was a lot going on in that place. I remember in '65 we built, there was 4 or 5 of us in the engine room, we built 500 and some engines, blueprinted. Well, when I went to work there was only 30-some people, including the secretaries. You know, how we turned that out. But a normal day was 8 in the morning to 10 at night. And then on the weekend, we was off to the racetrack, you know. I remember in '63, you know, they put me in the engine room, and for the 10 years I was there, I stayed in the engine room the whole time. I wanted to get out because that was standing on your feet, you know, from 8 in the morning to 10 at night. It was tough. And, but I could never get out of the engine room. But, you know, on the weekends then we was off to the racetrack because in '63 they put me on Fireball pit crew, and then in '64 Lorenzo and Moody come along and want me to be the jackman on their car. But that's all about getting the engines that I built. But they come to me and want me to be the jackman. I'm thinking, I've never been a jackman, but I was very athletic in high school. I can do it. So there were several guys in the shop wanted to be that too. They wanted a shot at it. So then we had tryouts. And the first time they said I didn't do it right, I cheated. So then Ralph said, well, do it again. Well, I had a little feel for it then. I'd never done it before. So I was a lot quicker the next time, and the guys, they all just went out the door. So anyway, I was the jackman. And then it went to, I was out for the year, and then went to change the front tire. And then through the rest of my career, I was a front tire changer. Well, you know, they didn't really get along that well, but anyway, they made it work, and they were very successful. And, you know, building the cars, building the engines, and not only that, running race cars. Normally we run 2 to 3 out of the shop. You know, start with Fireball and Ransom, and you know, David Pearson, Bobby Allison. There's a lot of drivers that went through Holman-Moody, and real good drivers. Mayo Andretti, AJ Floyd, they drove out of there at times. You know, I had a little room where I built the engine for the company car. I was always on the company car. I was always wanting to make more horsepower than the last one. So that was an ongoing battle. You make horsepower, and at the same time, you got to make sure it was durable for 500 miles.
Those that might be interested in more detail about Holman-Moody and what they did and the history of them, my good friend Tom Cotter wrote a book quite a few years ago, probably 15 years ago now, that's very detailed, a lot of photographs and a lot of history in it. It's really a good read.